Hey, Coach Robert here. So in this video, we're going to look at a checkmate that's really important to learn. It's not as important or as basic as maybe the back rank mate and the lawnmower mate or the rook roller, but it's still one that comes up in games a lot. Okay, so to give an example, I was teaching this checkmate pattern and I told the kids when I was done, hey, you probably want to practice this. It's not super easy. You probably want to practice it. Don't just play your games. And some of the kids said, hey, can we just play your games? I was like, you can, but I promise you, if you just play your game, you're going to run into this checkmate and you're not going to know how to do it. So, do you want to win or not? They're like, I just want to play some games. So I was like, okay, sure, have fun. And we get to about the end of the time, and they call me over. They're like, hey, we're in this position. What do we do? And I'm looking at the board, and it was this position. It was literally the checkmate I had just taught them. And so I was like, you see? This is exactly what I tried to get you to learn. They're really embarrassed. We laughed about it. Hopefully they'll go back and they will practice it and learn it. Hopefully you will practice this and learn this too. But the checkmate we're talking about is the king and the rook versus a king, the rook mate. Okay, so there's actually a couple ways to do this, and one is simpler and more straightforward, and one is faster. You can do it in fewer moves. And I'm going to show you both ways of doing it. We're going to start with the simpler one that I call the snake. Now, I just started calling out the snake today because some of the kids I was showing this to today when I was teaching, one of them said, hey, it looks like their king just snaked up the board. I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's a cool way of thinking of it. So this one's called the snake. The snake method works a lot like the lawnmower mate. Now, if you remember, a lawnmower mate, what you do is you use one rook or queen to cut off one row or column, and then another one to give check. And then when the king steps back, then the other rook would come up and cut off. And you'd keep doing this until you get all the way to the edge of the board and you deliver checkmate on the edge of the board. Well, the same is going to work here, except for instead of having two rooks or a rook and a queen, we have a rook and a king. Well, a king can't cut off a whole row, but it can cut off 3 squares. And that's really all you need if your opponent's king is close enough to you. And so the king can be used to prevent the opponent's king from moving back towards the center while the rook applies check and takes away the next row. And so that's what we're going to look at first. And so when you do that, the first thing you want to do is you want to take your rook and move it to where it is cutting off the opponent's king's escape back to the center of the board. All right. So now this king is trapped up in this upper box, right? There's no place for him to go. He is stuck right here and this way, right? So the next thing is that king doesn't want to be stuck. The king is going to try to come over here and chase away your rook. So he's going to move this way. This is when you go ahead and bring your king closer, all right? So now our kings are 2 rows apart. Obviously, they can't be right next to each other. Kings aren't allowed to touch. When this king gets close to your rook, you don't want to leave your row, right? You want to keep the rook right here on this row. So we're going to take the rook and keep it on the row, but put it as far away from that king as possible. All right. So now if the king is going to get back to this rook, he's going to have to walk in front of my king. All right. So if he comes this way, oh, okay, this is really good because remember, my king is blocking these 3 squares, right? So if I move the rook up right now, if I move the rook here, then this king can get out, right? He can move away. Well, I don't want that. I'd rather this black king be right across. That way, if I move my rook up, it can't go away. So I need to wait a turn. So I don't want to give up the row, and I don't want this black king getting too close to my rook. So I'm just going to move the rook over 1 square just to wait for a second. Now the black king has some choices. If he's trying to stay close to the center, he can go right or he can go left. Let me show you what to do if he goes right, because that would be faster. If the king goes to the right, now remember, our our king is blocking off these 3 squares, which means now if I move the rook here, we'll be blocking off all 6 of these squares, and the king has to step back towards the wall. All right, so let's do that. Obviously, again, the king is going to want to come towards the rook. So just swing your rook all the way to the other side. King will try to chase you down. Your king can step in front. So now if he moves over, we move up and drive him back again. So the smart thing is for the king to actually run away now. Run towards the far edge of the board. And eventually he can't run any further and he has to come back. And then you put him in check. All right, see, remember our king is blocking off these 3 squares. Now our rook has taken off the next 3, and the only option is for the king to go to the edge of the board. Our king follows. The king steps towards your rook. Put your king between your rook and their king. So now if he's going to try to chase your rook, then it's just going to be checkmate, right? So he's going to run to the edge of the board, all the way across. Okay, now he has no choice but to step in front, and then we can deliver checkmate, where our king is blocking off the 3 escape squares, and the rook is attacking the whole row, just like you would see in a lawnmower mate, or even in a back rank mate, where instead of our king, they have 3 pawns in front of them. All right, so that's one way to do it. That one's the simple way. And if we back up again, let's back up pretty far and watch the path the black king takes in all this, right? Left, left, right, right, up, left, right, right, all the way to the edge of the board. And he just kind of snakes all the way back until it's checkmate. So that is what I now call the snake method of checkmating with a king and rook. And that one's the simple one, because you just have to wait until their king steps in front of your king, check with the rook, follow with the king, and start the process over again. Okay, so that was the faster one. Let's look, sorry, the simpler one. Let's look at the fast one. All right, let's go back to our let's go back all the way to the starting position again. Now this one is called the box. I call it the box. It kind of works like the king and queen mate, where you use the queen to create a box around the king. We're going to do the same thing with the rook though. We want to create the smallest box possible. And so the first thing I want to do is I'm going to, just looking at where that king is, I'm going to bring my rook over. Let's do d2. There's several choices. I could go to e2. I could go to b5. All that matters is, actually, yeah, let's do b5. We're going to go to b5. But the idea is I want to get my rook and my king connected pretty soon, as close to the king, as close to the opponent's king as possible. So when you do this with a king and queen, the queen can do it by herself because the black king can never approach your queen. But when you do it with a rook, your rook needs some help. He can't protect himself. You need your king to help. So we're going to come to b5. Again, the black king is going to come chase. The white king will come up. But the moment the black king gets too close to the rook just goes and touches your king. All right? You see, black can't take the rook now because your king is protecting it. Okay, so now black has to make a choice. The rook has created a box around the king. And we want to keep making this box tighter and tighter and tighter until the king is on the edge of the board and has nowhere to go, and then we just set up the checkmate. So the black king can go back towards one of the edges. In this position, it's the same either way because this is a symmetrical position, or you can just go towards the corner. Most people don't go to the corner. If they do, it doesn't really make a difference. The idea is right now your king is as far away from the black king as possible, so you're going to have to use your king to get closer in so your rook can make a tighter box. So let's say the king steps here. Then you're going to bring your king closer to their king. The king steps back. Your king comes closer. Right? See, now the rook can make steps to make a tighter box. If the king steps towards the wall, the rook comes closer. If the king ever steps away from the rook and away from the king, so we see the king's down here. If the king ever steps away from the king, you bring your king up to follow. So let's see that. So the king steps back, your king comes to follow. Now notice the rook is covering these, and your king is covering these squares. So you've already got a box made with the rook and the king. So the king has to either go all the way to the wall right away. So again, he's only got a few choices here. He can go back to the far wall, he can go back to the left wall, or go back to the corner. If he goes back to the left wall, in this case, remember, you're blocking off these squares. Your rook can go ahead and come on up and check, forcing the king to come off of the wall, allowing you to step up. Now the black king only has one legal move over to the corner, and it's checkmate. See, that was a lot faster. That only took a handful of moves, as opposed to watching the king snake all the way across the board. But it is a little trickier because there's no real set pattern like with the snake version. You kind of have to be clever. You have to think about, okay, what do I do to keep my king and my rook touching and making the box smaller? So the main idea is try to follow their king with your king, and whenever you get a chance, make the box tighter. So don't try to rush making the box tighter, just follow their king with your king, and then make the box tighter whenever possible. So we said, let's say if the king steps this way, just follow with the king. King steps, just come up with a king. If the king steps parallel to the king, bring your rook closer. Steps parallel again, then you're in great shape. You've already cut him off, his entire escape, and then just get your king close enough to deliver the checkmate. Now remember, at this point, you don't want to make a move with your king, because when your kings are not directly opposed, but they're one away, you never want to step into opposition. You want them to step into opposition when you're doing the rook mate. So you need to wait. So you just take your rook and make a waiting move. Black king steps over, you get closer in, then they step across for opposition, and it's checkmate. Okay, so there are lots of ways to do the box mate. That one you get to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more clever. The advantage to the box version is that it is faster. One rule that a lot of people don't realize, but is really important to know, is that if you make 50 moves without capturing a piece or advancing a pawn, the game is a draw. All right? So here's the difficulty with doing the snake method, is it can take as many as 20 to 25 moves, and if you mess up, you've got to start over sometimes. If you let the king escape, and that can really push you close to that 50 move limit. But it's simpler. It's just a simple pattern. Check the king moves back, follow with your king, and then swing your rook to one side or the other as you need until the kings are opposed. Check again. The box method, you avoid the risk of it taking 50 moves because it's so much faster. In the worst position, it's usually like mate and 12 in the worst scenario. But you do have to be clever, and it is a little more risky because your rook stays really close to their king the whole time. And so if you accidentally separate your rook from your king, bye-bye rook, and then it's a draw. That's no fun. That's not what you want. So practice both of these. Make sure you feel good with whichever one you like the best, so that when you see it in a game, then you can do it. Find some chances to practice. If you get on Chess Kid, they actually have a workout position where you can do the king and the rook and just practice that against a computer, and the computer will tell you when you mess up. So you could practice it there, or you could practice it with your friends. But good luck learning the king and rook mate, and hopefully when you encounter in the game, you will be ready. You'll get checkmate, and you'll get to celebrate that victory. All right, I'll see you next time.